Okay, so a lot of people just ask the basic question, well, what is oral history? Well, oral history, the word oral itself is a reference to being spoken. One thing to keep in mind here is that I'm talking about spoken history. Oral history in the historical sense can mean any kind of oral transmission, oral transmission of knowledge. So it could be song, it could be stories, it could be speeches, it could be anything that goes along with that. So, but in general, that's what we refer to as spoken history. You know, for the Oneida people, this is our history. Oral history was the way that we transmitted knowledge. Everything, you know, we didn't have a writing system. It wasn't our way in our traditional mindset. So, but when we talk about oral history sort of in an academic sense or in a historical sense, what we're really talking about is the gathering of that knowledge and putting it down, recording it, right? So that's kind of why I think most of you are here. And really that knowledge, you know, can tend to transfer from generation to generation at times, or person to person. But the sooner that it's able to be recorded, the more safe it is, right? You guys ever play that game on the playground as kids where you whisper in one person's ear a message and then they have to whisper to somebody else, and by the time you get to the end of it, it sounds like a pink elephant walked down Broadway, and it just doesn't make any sense. And that can happen with oral histories. Over time, details and the personal nature of those stories can be lost. So it's really important to get that recorded as soon as possible. In oral history, as far as humankind is concerned, that's been our main way of recording history for who knows how long. And I guess in a historical perspective too, for the Oneida people, really writing history down has only been maybe in the last 100 years or so, which really isn't that long. If we go back to each of us here, if we go back to our grandparents or great-grandparents' generation, probably not many of them were very well versed in English and even in writing. So we wouldn't have to go back very far to find that. Right. So this picture here isn't meant to depict any specific group of people, but really this is kind of where it begins. And the funny part about it is that despite computers, despite email, despite Facebook, we're still an oral culture to a certain extent. I mean, how many times do you hear the stories of, did you hear what so-and-so did at work, or you know what your daughter did last night? We get all those stories, right? But if you sit and think about it, that really is oral history too. And you visit with your relatives and you learn those stories, right? So that oral history is still something part of us even today. Pros and cons. There are some things to consider if you're looking at using oral history as a way of documenting. Oral history can be very subjective. You have to realize that, because if you were to do an oral history with Adolf Hitler about what his opinion was, it would be very different than a Jew who was in a concentration camp, right? So you can get very different perspectives. That might be a bit extreme, but even in subtle things, if you ask about why your grandparents, great-grandparents got divorced, or something like that. Different sides of the family might remember different parts of the story. So, very important to remember, especially when you're doing family histories or genealogy. Technology advancements. This can be quite tricky. Just 50 years ago, when people did oral histories, they were usually using some sort of magnetic tapes, right? That technology is all gone. I mean, if you find one of those things in a drawer, most people don't even know what they are. So that technology, there are still some people out there today that can, they call it migrating that information, migrate it to a current media. There are still some people out there that can do that, but it's getting harder and harder to find people with equipment that can do that. And if you started out, let's say with, what are those, the 16, 8-track. 8-track, yeah, that's what it is. 8-track tapes, right? Let's say you did a really great interview with somebody on an 8-track tape, and then the next thing that came across was the cassette tapes, right? So you record from the 8-track tape to a cassette tape. Well, the next time thing comes along is a DVD, right? well, actually it was a CD first.
So VHS.
Well, yeah, VHS in some cases. So then you go to that, and then you go, to the digital disc, the CD discs or whatever it is, and then you go to a digital file on your hard drive on your computer. Every time you do that, it degrades the quality of that. So you're going to lose a certain amount of it, and if it happens too fast, you can almost lose the entire quality of that piece, to the point where you wouldn't be able to hear it. Also, with the older media specifically, those magnetic tapes and things like that, they can deteriorate really fast. Especially if you have, I don't know if anybody here has boxes in their closet of old cassette tapes or anything like that. If one of them really starts to spoil, it can spoil a chain reaction into the rest of it. So there's things to be careful with.
I heard CDs and DVDs are dissolving too.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I don't. This is my personal opinion, but I don't think it'll be long, and everything is going to be either this, or it's going to be just your handheld device. Because in all honesty, this little thumb drive that I have right here, almost all my CDs that I own are on this, and I don't have a very giant collection of on a shelf. They're maybe about this wide, but just about all the CDs I own are on here.
And you recorded them?
I just ripped them from my CD onto this. That way, when I come to work, I don't have to bring CDs with me. And I don't know what the internet usage with streaming media and stuff like that. So I just plug my thumb drive in, and media player plays it off of there. But that's my personal opinion on the matter. So.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I have a question. How can a cassette spoil? What does that do?
In cassette tapes, I shouldn't say that exclusively to them, but like those old 16mm film rolls and stuff like that. Those are probably more susceptible to going bad. But those work off of a chemical reaction, right? That's how they develop. The magnetic tapes, it's more of just fading. It's not really a chemical reaction there. It's more of fading, so they can. Over time, it's kind of like the quality just degrades as the tape itself just gets older. But like some of those things, if they use chemical reactions, over time those materials continue to break down. And so, like this happens in archives sometimes where they have these old big round tins with the film rolls in it. Those will actually start to give off a stink, a smell. It's kind of smell like vinegar. And once that chemical process starts to break down to a certain point, it will pass from roll to roll. So, yeah, and with cassette tapes and things like that.
That's what the tin was for, though. Was to keep everything.
Well, you would think, but it can, because the air still exchanges to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So, and it's not good once that starts to happen. Same thing with paper archives. Papers can start to deteriorate, and all that kind of stuff. So, other pros and cons. Oral history really does not require a lot of high-tech equipment. High-tech equipment will help ensure good quality, as long as you understand how to use it and the advantages of it. But really, like if you were in a pinch and wanted to record somebody, most cell phones nowadays have recorders on them that are better than any recorder you could have had 30 years ago. So, I mean, in a pinch you can do oral history pretty quickly and pretty inexpensively. And one of the biggest things about oral history is it's unique. You're getting a slice of perspective that you can't get anywhere else, right? And I use the example that, if you were to do a book, let's say you want to write a book on World War II, right? You can do all the research and documents, government documents, and news media and all that kind of stuff you want about it, but really the personal stories, you're going to get those from people, right? And to me, that's what history is about. We can talk about all these high-level policies and government and all that kind of stuff, but to me, history is best when it's personal, because that's real. That's how it affects people.
Oh, look at what the word history means. His story.
Right. Exactly. Yep. All right. So, why record oral histories? Well, oral histories help us understand other people and other times. really, that's one thing I like about it. You know, I'm bald, not old. So I'm 30 years old, and I had some kid guess that I was 47, so you can tell I have a little bit of a complex. But the unique thing about oral history is you can get into a world that isn't really your own, right? You can go and you can record stories from people in a different, you know, background, different cultures, different perspectives that you wouldn't normally get a glimpse at, right? And that's the great thing about oral history. You get into somebody else's mind frame, somebody else's world. And, you know, I love oral history because of that. And, you know, it allows us to preserve our stories. We can record our own stories, right? We can really just make that a point to leave our own record behind. And, you know, not a lot of people are good at writing in journals today. You know, how many people here have ever bought a journal with the intention of recording in there, and then you've never...
I got 1,000 of them.
Yeah, right? I mean, I think most of us have done that.
I've given them away as gifts because they don't work for me.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a really good way of maybe doing that, is maybe you just sit in front of your computer and you get one of those little cameras that goes on top and you just record, you know, whatever it is that happened in your day or something. You know, that we can do. You know, that's easy to do. And then today's communication is disposable, right? How many of you guys text? Anybody text? Text messaging? Email? Right? All of those digital media things that don't really leave a permanent record in our home. You know, it's somewhere out there in cyberspace, but you know, when are we ever going to get access to that? And then oral histories are considered a primary source material. And primary sources are, they're kind of like the bread and butter of doing research or of good quality historical documents. You know, if you go out to the Oneida Library and you pick out a book in the history section, it's more than likely going to be a secondary source. It's a reference that somebody has made off of something they learned somewhere else, right? Primary source material is different because it's direct perspective, right? So if you had all the letters from George Washington to the Oneida Chiefs, or the Oneida Chiefs to George Washington, that would be primary source material because it's the people that were there, right? Does that make sense? So oral history is a primary source, which makes it a very valuable source. And plus, anyone can do it. You don't have to be well trained. You don't have to have a PhD. You could go out tonight and sit down with somebody and record an oral history. But we're going to talk about some things that help you plan to be more effective. So, before I do this, I'm gonna interrupt here and I'm gonna play a video. There's 8 things that they talked about there, and this is what they are. So, when you want to do oral histories, there's some really important things that you need to know about. First of all, the trickiest thing can be copyright. Okay, so this is where usually if people make errors or make mistakes, this is usually where they're going to make a mistake. Copyright is very important because if you go out and you record a history from somebody, you don't have copyright of that material just because you're the one who did the interview. Copyright remains with the person. Okay, so it's very important that you have a form for them to sign that gives you permission to use that story. And you need to know exactly what it is that you're going to do with that story too. We'll talk about that. Number 2 is a structured, well-researched interview format. So there's a lot of things that go into that. You know, these are things that you can do, steps that you can do to really make sure that this oral history is a success, right? You know, you can kind of go out and just kind of shoot from the hip, but you might make a lot of mistakes along the way. And if you're starting out, if you've never done this before, if you follow some of these simple steps, I can guarantee it'll go a lot smoother for you. So that's some of the stuff we'll talk about. Number 3 is a thoughtful written out questions and follow-up questions, and we'll talk about why that's important. Number 4 is a controlled recorded interview setting. Eliza and I did a recording just a couple months ago up the hill here in the log homes that are up there. You guys know where those are? And one of the disadvantages to being up there is that we're just a few miles from the airport here. and the airplanes come and go right overhead. So, you know, and you know, if it's a nice summer day and you could be in the middle of an interview and all of a sudden, you know, somebody's drag racing down the street, or, you know, the dog's barking next door or something. So those are, you know, things that you got to keep in mind, and you know, the better you can control that setting, the better your interview will go. Number 5 is collection of first-hand information. So that would be any extra documentation that that person you're interviewing might have. So if they're telling you a story about somebody, maybe they have a photograph, or they might have a letter from that person, or, you know, if they're talking about somebody immigrating to the United States, maybe they have citizenship records, or you know, ticket stubs from being on the boat, or, you know, you never know what people have. So number 6 is higher quality equipment. You know, high quality equipment can be pretty expensive, but nowadays you can get pretty darn good equipment for pretty reasonable prices. You know, and even microphones, camcorders, you know, anything like that, you can get pretty cheap nowadays. You know, if this is something that you're thinking about doing more than just once, investing in something might be really worth it. You know, if this is something important to you.
Can you rent it?
Some cases you can. You know, if you ask around. I don't know, do you know anybody offhand that rents audio equipment? I do.
I think I know there is a place in Green Bay that does it, but I can't think of their name offhand.
Yeah, you know, there's Camera Corner and like places like that, and I honestly don't know, but I would think somewhere you could do that, but you know, you just don't know till you ask. So, and then number 7 is careful processing of all materials. So, with oral histories, you want to try and keep documentation, right, of everything you're doing. The people you're interviewing, when you're interviewing them, why you did it, and keep all that stuff organized, because it will pay off. It'll help you in the end. And number 8 is making the oral history available. This is maybe one of the most important parts of that. That number 8 here, that's pretty much the same thing as number 2. If you want to get started, the first thing you have to do is learn about oral histories. Congratulations, you're here. So you're doing that. All right. Number 2 is determine the purpose of your project. What is your end in mind? Why are you doing it? You know, and it's great to collect oral histories just because it's a great story, but what are you going to do with it? Why would you need it in the first place? You know, and as you sit and think about the story itself, that might help you tell you why you're going to collect it. But really having a specific purpose, you know, that might be just to record your family genealogy. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a big grand design. It could be something real simple. Or maybe it's because you know a lot of people who are involved with some political event, or, you know, some important thing that happened to your community, and you want to record all those oral histories and then get them into a library where they'll be safe for a long time. Some sort of, they call it like a repository archive. Once you've done those things, you're going to be able to establish who to interview. If you know what story you're telling, that'll tell you who you have to talk to. So that's another big part. Once you've done most of that, I'd say you're well on your way. The rest of it becomes, I think, a lot easier. And then number 4 is do general research on the topic. So this is really important because the more you know about the topic, the more you're going to be able to ask people, you know, and get their understanding. If I was going to interview a Korean War vet, I would want to know a little bit about the Korean War, right? I wasn't there, so I need to do some research and find out what battles happened, and what the political atmosphere was like in the United States, and what the troops thought, and that kind of stuff. A lot of different questions that you can ask. And then number 5 is become familiar with the recording equipment that you're going to use. One of the worst things that could happen is to you know, buy a brand new piece of equipment, get real excited, go out and do an interview, and you get there and you show up, and then, okay, I gotta open the plastic and look at the directions and all that kind of stuff, and there's your person waiting for you to do your interview. So, we're gonna watch another little video here. Okay, close. So that's kind of a quick get started lesson there. The next part is actually just doing the preparation for the interview. So one of the most important things you want to do is contact your narrator. Narrator being the person you're going to interview. And just give them the information about your project. And like they said in the video, you got to be upfront about it. What is the intent that you're going to do this? You know, if you tell somebody that you're collecting stories because you're curious, you know, just curious, want to know more, it's for family purposes, something like that, and then you end up putting it on display in a museum, you might get some people upset. So you want to make sure that you have that clear from the very beginning, and tell them about your project, and let them know, you know, what it is that you're hoping that they'll commit to. If it's an hour interview, a 2-hour interview, be sparing with that, because if it takes less time, that's not such a big deal. And then gather information about the narrators. You know, if I was going to do a interview with Rick Hill, for example, past tribal chairman or something like that, I would want to know something about Rick Hill before the interview. Right? I would want to know what kind of things he did while he was in office, and you know, just something like that. So it's always good to know as much as you can, and then review what you know about them. If you don't know a lot about a person, you can do what they call a pre-interview interview. Where you go maybe and you spend maybe just 15-20 minutes. It doesn't have to be a lot of time. And you just get to know them, let them get comfortable with who you are, and just get to know you a little bit too. And then you're set to begin to do some research. Good research leads to good interview questions. I can't emphasize that enough. You know, like I said, if you want to do an interview with somebody about what it was like going to a boarding school, you kind of got to know what kind of things happen in boarding schools. So you can develop really good questions that won't be threatening to that person, but invite them to tell their story. So it's really important to understand those things. Writing interview questions. There's a couple basic things that you should do here. One is just brainstorm questions. Just think of as many as you can, right? Anything and everything. And if you're not coming up with a whole lot, talk to somebody else and say, if I was to interview you about this subject, or if you were going to interview people, what kind of questions would you want to know? What would you want to know about this topic? Just get as many as you can. You can always narrow them down later, and maybe writing one question down will spark something in your mind for another question. And it's really important to ask open-ended questions. This is really, really important, because if you were to ask somebody, did you go to boarding school? Yes. Their response would be yes. Or no. And then there'd be silence. But if you ask them the question, what was it like on your first day at boarding school? That's a lot more thought-provoking, right? It gets them to think and to really reflect and to open up and tell a story, right? So the best kinds of questions are those questions that are really going to get them going. And not just fling out an answer and be done. So, send your narrator a copy of the questions. This is really crucial. Once you have a good list of questions and ideas, things down, go ahead and send it right to that person. Just drop it in the mail, email it, whatever you need to do. And let them kind of think about things, you know, a little bit. They might make some notes of things that they want to share, you know, especially if you're dealing with elderly people. A lot of times they have a hard time remembering what it was they wanted to say, right? But if they can write it down or make some notes, then they can go, oh yeah, I was going to share this with you too. And then putting questions into a script, basically all that really means is to just kind of put them in order. You know, there's you know, when you do your interview, depending on your topic, there might be some order that's better than another order. If you were doing something about politics, you might go theme by theme, where if you were doing something about somebody's life story, you'd probably go chronologically, right? So it just depends on what you're talking about with that person. When you conduct the actual interview, you want to set up the interview environment. You know, and like we talked about, the more control you have over that environment, the better. One of the worst things that can happen is you're right in the middle of a really touching story. Maybe the person's gotten a little bit emotional and they're sharing this with you, and all of a sudden the phone rings, right? So it's not inappropriate to ask if we can turn the ringer off on a phone or unplug it for the purpose of doing the interview. That's okay to do that. You know, make sure that if the dog is in the house, that it's, you know, got food and water and been outside, and can be put away somewhere in a room or downstairs or something. And then follow your format. Whatever that is, try to stick to that. You know, and sometimes people will go off on these long tangents. And that's hard to rein in sometimes, but with a little bit of practice, I think that's kind of easy. And then wrapping up after the interview, you always want to make sure that you express your sincere thanks to that person. They have spent some real quality time with you. You know, time is hard to come by sometimes these days. And, you know, if they've given up something so personal to you, it's really good to make sure that you give them your sincere thanks and end that interview on a really good note. You know, give them a time to reflect and think about that kind of stuff. And it's also a good time to review with them what the purpose is behind your project, so that once again you're reminding them this is what the intention is, and you know, if they have any reservations about that, hopefully they've already expressed it a long time. And just a couple more things here. Cultural respect. You know, being that we're connected here to the Oneida Nation, there's some things to keep in mind. For us specifically, there are people in our community that do not want to be videotaped or even sound recorded. And there's cultural reasons that go into that. You know, I'm not sure I'm the best person to explain those things, but it's really important to be upfront and honest with somebody when you ask them if you can do an oral history with them, about what your intentions are, so that they can have the opportunity to say, well, I prefer you don't videotape me or record me. Bob Brown is our cultural advisor here. He's an Oneida chief, and he does not like to be recorded. There have been times when he's been recorded, but he doesn't like to do that. He avoids it when he can. So there have been times that he has allowed me to record him with the purpose of that, taking that recording then and transcribing it or typing it out, and then destroying the sound file. You know, he's allowed me to do that a couple of times. So the things to keep in mind, be aware of. You know, if you're going into another culture that you're not familiar with, there might be things that you just don't know. For example, among the Hmong culture, if you go into, if you're a man, for example, and you go to visit with some Hmong people, if you knock on somebody's door and a woman answers and her husband's not home, she's not going to let another man into her house. It wouldn't matter if there were other women there with her. If her husband's not home, she's not letting you in. That's a cultural practice that the traditional Hmong people have. So that's important to understand those concepts and things and become familiar with those. If you don't know those, do some research. Talk to a university professor. Ask anybody who would know. And good things to keep in mind. And then this is, you know, a good place to be when you're conducting an interview, is knowing that you're on their time, because they're the one doing the courtesy of giving the interviews. And then forms. I'm going to talk about forms just a little bit. You know, nobody likes to do paperwork, so paperwork can, in oral history process, can kind of be just flung to the side and people never look at it. But if you're doing an oral history project, especially if you're going to do more than one oral history, it's really good to have, I'll just give a couple of these here, some understanding of what forms you will need to help keep you organized and to keep your information in a place where you can easily find what you're looking for. The first few pages here are one document, and they are the biography form. So this is something that you'd want to send to somebody before you even start preparing for the interview. You want to send this out to them and find out a little bit about them. Mail it to them or drop it off, email it, whatever you need to do, and let them fill it out. Just get some real basic information, because this is where you'll start. This is where you'll start to wonder about certain situations, certain things that have happened in their family, and how that might have affected them. If you're, you know, if you're going to conduct an interview with somebody who was a migrant from another country, and you notice one of their children died right around the time they were migrating, that might be something you would want to ask them, how hard that would be to leave, you know, to have to bury somebody and then leave them behind. when you come to a new country. You know, those are things that can spark questions, right? Going on to the next part, the donor release form. This is where we're talking about the copyright. If you look, there's a couple of lines there, and then in the middle there it says, by signing the form below, you give your permission for any tapes and/or photographs made during this project to be used by researchers and the public for educational purposes, including publications, exhibitions, World Wide Web, and presentations. By giving your permission, you do not give up any copyright or performance rights that you may hold. So again, this is very, very specific. By having them sign this form, you don't just all of a sudden have copyright, but you have permission to use theirs. Does that make sense? Okay. And you can modify this, you know, if you're not using cassette tapes or any kind of tape, you can put digital recordings, you can, you know, make that up. If you're going to make your own donor form like this, I would suggest that you try and get somebody who's versed in law or copyright to look at it. Don't bring it to me because I'm not the best at knowing those kind of things. And you know, don't take it to your Thursday lunch buddy because they may not necessarily know either.
Is this been?
These are forms all from the Minnesota State Historical Society. So these, you know, I mean, I'm sure they have some sort of disclaimer on the form, you know, providing that kind of information, but I think it's a good place to start. So. And then there's an example of what you might use to log photographs here. And you could even make a similar form for logging documents that people might share with you. You might want to photograph some of those images or the documents when you go to do the actual log. And then it says tape log here, but if you're using a camera that creates digital files, maybe it works with an external hard drive, or you know, you have a digital recorder, you might still want to use this because that information will help you remember what was on a file, right? If the file gets misplaced or if the file gets renamed at something, you know, that way you know what's in there and you have that background information. Once you start an interview, if you're kind of nervous and you jump into the interview questions, you may forget to say at the beginning of that tape, this is Nick Reynolds doing an interview with Gina Funmaker on January 25th at the Oneida Cultural Heritage. It's good information to have on a log so that you don't forget when that happened and all that kind of stuff. And then information about the interview itself. So some forms to help you get started there. We're going to watch just a couple, I think there's, I forget how many more, there's 3 more of these. I kind of skipped through some of this. But we're going to watch these videos and